History as it happens, July 18th, 2023. Whole and free.
The world has waited long enough. The time is right. Let Europe be whole and free.
On Germany, I emphasize the importance of a unified Germany being in NATO.
These steps represent a tribute to the statesmanship and leadership of President Kravchuk and to the vision of the Ukrainian people.
We must promote the development of a new security system that is based on the realities of today's Europe, not on the artificial lines drawn to divide Europe during the Cold War.
This partnership will advance a process of evolution for NATO's formal enlargement.
Whether or not to bring three of Europe's new democracies, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, into the NATO alliance.
In Russia today, the clear winner of the Russian presidential election, Vladimir Putin, began to establish the Putin era.
Russia is not the enemy of the United States.
But NATO has never been only about defense.
The Cold War days are over.
The Cold War is over.
The Cold War is over.
Since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there's been talk, though not much meaningful action, about Ukraine possibly someday joining NATO. It never happened, and Russia never became a democracy with a free market economy either. Today, in the midst of Europe's worst war since 1945, there are new calls for NATO to accept Ukraine. Why it won't happen soon is for some of the same reasons it didn't happen before. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And now in Vilnius, to declare to the world what I say again, we will not waver. We will not waver. I mean that. Our commitment to Ukraine will not weaken. We will stand for liberty and freedom today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes.
A few years ago, when Donald Trump was in the White House, French President Emmanuel Macron said NATO was brain dead, and he doubted whether the U.S. really wanted to be part of the alliance anymore. Well, if NATO needed a purpose, Vladimir Putin provided one about 500 days ago when he ordered the Russian army to invade Ukraine. His unprovoked invasion revived and unified the alliance. Tens of billions in arms and humanitarian aid have flowed to Kyiv, although Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Rather, Ukraine's been stuck on the wrong side of Europe's dividing line, which used to run through Germany during the Cold War, but over the past quarter century's moved all the way up to Russia's borders. To borrow a line from historian Mary Elise Sarati, it's been the worst of both worlds. Ukraine never made it into the club, but just the idea of it, announced by President George W. Bush at the Bucharest summit in 2008, helped poison U.S.-Russia relations anyway. A Ukraine in NATO was the reddest of Russian red lines.
Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO and offers them a clear path forward to meet that goal.
Now fast forward to the Vilnius summit last week. The language agreed upon by the 31 NATO allies was, we'll be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. Vague enough? Well, they did remove the requirement for a membership action plan while creating a new NATO-Ukraine Council. And so continues a dance that's been going on at varying levels of enthusiasm for more than 30 years. And not just between the alliance and Ukraine, but between the U.S. and Moscow, too. Because from the moment the post-Soviet era started coming into view, where and when NATO should expand has been controversial. Neither Gorbachev nor Yeltsin was happy about it, although both relented to something they could not stop. And remember, the newly liberated states of the old Soviet bloc, such as Poland, wanted to join the alliance. But first, there was the challenge of Germany. June 1990, Secretary of State James Baker testifying before Congress about that year's upcoming NATO summit. And this was just a few months after he had suggested to Gorbachev that NATO jurisdiction, as Mary Elise Sarati has written, might not shift 1 inch eastward from its present position in Germany after reunification.
The European community and NATO represent the will of free peoples cooperating on both sides of the Atlantic to assure democracy, peace, and prosperity. And that is why, Mr. Chairman, that we and so many Europeans, including the Germans, believe that the new Germany should be a full member of a vigorous NATO alliance. NATO, like all European institutions, will evolve to deal with the new situation in Europe. But of this, I think we can be sure. It will remain a defensive alliance with an appropriate mix of nuclear and conventional forces designed to preserve peace and security and not to start war.
Mr. Secretary, given the Soviet insistence that they don't want a united Germany in NATO and your belief that they're moving away from insisting on neutrality, do you see as a possible solution the membership of Germany in both alliances, as the foreign minister suggested?
I heard that suggestion. I will admit to you, I heard it during the course of his press conference, and I will admit to you that's the first time I've heard that suggestion. I would simply point out to you that there are a number of members of the Warsaw Pact that agree with us that the unified Germany should be a member of NATO.
A few months later, by signing the treaty to allow Germany to reunify, the Soviets agreed that foreign NATO troops could cross the old Cold War dividing line. But that hasn't stopped Putin and other Russian revanchists from claiming the Americans broke their promise about NATO moving eastward. So what does this old story have to do with Ukraine today? How does it help us answer the question as to why it never made it into NATO? Had Ukraine been able to join the alliance, the argument goes, Russia would not have attacked last year. Well, it has something to do with where or how far east the new dividing line would fall. Soviet, then Russian protests didn't end with German reunification. A major reason why the Clinton administration proposed the Partnership for Peace was to placate Moscow's concerns about adding former Eastern Bloc countries or even former Soviet republics to the alliance. Here is then Defense Secretary Les Aspin explaining why the partnership was a good idea at a news conference in December 1993.
How do you deal with the question of membership? And who do you include and who you exclude and what signals do you send? And it's fraught with all kinds of dangers and all kinds of difficulties. What we are doing with this proposal is to not base anything on the basis of geography. We're offering an opportunity for all of the countries, all the NACC countries, to participate. And saying that the people who will participate, it will be their choice. It will be a choice that each individual country makes.
But the Partnership for Peace, which was supposed to be a club for all, including Russia even, caved under considerable pressure for full NATO membership for some.
Today we are joined by the leaders of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, whose descent into darkness helped to spark NATO's creation.
In 1997, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland were invited to begin negotiations, and 2 years later, they became the first former Warsaw Pact countries to accede to NATO.
Prime Minister Orban, President Havel, President Kwasniewski, welcome to NATO, welcome home to the community of freedom.
And in a sort of repeat of the 1990 Baker-Gorbachev story, Yeltsin claimed he had been misled by U.S. leaders. By the time Vladimir Putin used the Munich Security Conference in 2007 to reject the European Security Order, a speech in which he accused the United States of creating a unipolar world, 7 more countries that were once dominated by the Soviet Union, or in Slovenia's case, part of communist Yugoslavia, had joined NATO. But not Ukraine. Why? The answers are as practical as they are political, and here are a few, provided by Anatol Levin, Sergei Radchenko, and Vladislav Zubak, all experts on Russia with whom I've been exchanging emails this week. Ukraine in the 1990s was hopelessly unready for NATO membership, deeply corrupt, in steep economic decline, chaotic, and with a wholly unreformed Soviet military. Not only was Ukraine seen in Washington as a deeply corrupt, unstable country, but the priority was clearly with keeping the Russians at ease. Membership was not ruled out as a matter of principle, but it was just not a practical proposition. Even getting the Hungarians, Czechs, and the Polish into NATO seemed challenging given the fallout for relations with Russia, never mind Ukraine. But American policymakers started changing their minds about Ukraine's prospects after its Orange Revolution in late 2004. Now, maybe Ukraine could be separated from Russia. George W. Bush believes so.
These two nations inspired the world with their Rose and Orange revolutions. And now they're working to consolidate their democratic gains and cement their independence. Welcoming them into the Membership Action Plan would send a signal to their citizens that if they continue on the path to democracy and reform, they will be welcomed into the institutions of Europe.
But as Zubok tells me, Bush's blunder at Bucharest in April 2008 turned Ukraine into a contested gray zone in the Kremlin's eyes. But no matter, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in August of that year, 2 weeks after Russia had invaded Georgia, where its troops remain to this day, said Moscow could not veto NATO membership by etching its own dividing line across the map.
There will absolutely be no new line. NATO does not accept that there is a new line, and we are acting as if there is no new line. That is why both the establishment of the NATO Georgia Commission and the meeting that will take place next week of the NATO Ukraine Commission, as well as the visit of NATO permanent representatives to Georgia, are important steps that demonstrate that principle. I want to underscore that NATO has an open door policy to all European democracies that qualify for its membership. This is not a matter of forcing countries into one alliance or another.
Now, this does not mean Russia invaded Ukraine last year because of NATO. The immediate cause, rather than the origins, of the current conflict has arguably more to do with the EU. Flashback to 2013. Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych canceled a big trade deal with the European Union after some arm twisting by the Kremlin. His turn back toward Moscow, just as it seemed Ukraine was ready to leap into the arms of the West, caused another revolution in Kyiv. Yanukovych was ousted the following year. Putin retaliated by annexing Crimea, and then Russian forces helped set off a separatist war in the Donbass, the prelude to the full-scale invasion 8 years later.
In recent months, as the citizens of Ukraine have made their voices heard, we have been guided by a fundamental principle. The future of Ukraine must be decided by the people of Ukraine. We've seen an illegal referendum in Crimea, an illegitimate move by the Russians to annex Crimea. We're not going to go to war with Russia. The Ukrainians don't want that. We don't want that.
Since 2014, Vladimir Putin has used massive violence to try to keep Ukraine in Russia's orbit. Historian Jeffrey Engel is the founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University and is the author of When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. Welcome back to the podcast, Jeffrey Engel.
Always great to talk to you.
You know, when you came on the very first time, this was in early to mid 2021, we talked about Cold War 30 years later because the Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991. I don't know if we talked about Ukraine very much in that conversation, but we are going to talk about Ukraine today. So my first question to you is, it seems the fundamental issue of security for Central and Eastern Europe, the one that was there in '89, when George H.W. Bush becomes president, is still there today. It's just we're dealing with different countries, or in some cases, the same countries.
Yes. In fact, I'm actually going to go kind of big picture on you to say that American policymakers since 1945 have consistently said that the problem of European security is that Europe is filled with Europeans. And Europeans like to go to war with each other. That's what they do throughout history. Whether it's Germany, whether it's Russia, whether it's France back in the 18th century, every time Europeans get together, every generation, they have a new conflict zone. And American policymakers, since 1945, with the exception of only one president, who I'm sure we're going to talk about, have consistently said that the secret key to peace in Europe isn't a secret. It's that we don't leave it to the Europeans. It's that the United States must be there as de facto a European power.
Setting aside the question of whether Russia is a European nation or not.
Well, and that's a big, big question involved in all this.
But in '89, George H.W. Bush, Thatcher, all of them, they talked about the legacy of World War II and the First World War. That issue of whether Europe can pay and manage its own security is still trenchant. I mean, the answer is no. And why would they when the U.S. is still doing it all for them?
This is one of the general critiques, of course, of NATO in particular and of European security. Certainly it was fundamental to Donald Trump's entire campaign and time in office, was the idea that the Europeans could do more. The Europeans weren't paying enough for their own security, and that in some sense we were being duped. I actually think the opposite. I would argue that American policymakers, even when they complained, as they have since 1949, about Europeans not doing enough for their own security, about Europeans relying upon the United States too much, would always turn around and say to their fellow Americans as they walked out of the room, you know, that's not such a bad thing. Because so long as the Europeans are underfunding their militaries, we remain the most powerful military and the most powerful member of NATO.
Well, I want to get into the issue of what is NATO's purpose today, because there was just a New York Times op-ed written with the title or the headline, NATO isn't really about defense, and it never was. But back to my first question about the fundamental issue of security for Central and Eastern Europe, being there right from the beginning of the post-Cold War era. There's another piece to this. It was added after the collapse of the USSR, and that was, where would the new dividing line fall if there had to be a dividing line somewhere? So if and when NATO would move to the east, who would be left out? Who would be in? Obviously, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, they all wanted to be in NATO. Well, so did Ukraine, depending on which year we're talking about here. They never made it in. So that also is a problem that, well, obviously we're seeing that today. Ukraine never made it in. They're on the wrong side of that dividing line that all the presidents talked about. They didn't want to see that happen, yet their policies led in that direction.
I say to all those in Europe and the United States who would simply have us draw a new line in Europe further east, that we should not foreclose the possibility of the best possible future for Europe, which is a democracy everywhere, a market economy everywhere, people cooperating everywhere.
Let me actually add another country to your list, which I think is extraordinarily important, maybe the fundamental country in all of this discussion of where the line should exist, and that's Germany itself. Because at the end of the Cold War, in fact, one could argue, my advisor in graduate school used to argue all the time, that Germany was the central cause of the Cold War. That, yes, there were ideological differences, but the fight over who was going to control the industrial heartland of Europe, East or West, that was really the key question of the Cold War. And so at the end of the Cold War, there is a strong move afoot for the Germans not to unify and then join NATO, but rather to unify and drop out entirely. That perhaps the solution to Germans in history, the context of Cold War means the context of World War II, which means the Holocaust, which also means World War I, which also means the Franco-Prussian War. The problem of Germany in Europe could be solved, some Germans suggested, by simply going neutral or by simply going without a military entirely. And American policymakers went apoplectic at this idea. Two reasons. First, because the Germans were actually the second biggest contributor manpower-wise to NATO. Actually, they were the number one contributor manpower-wise, number two contributor financially. And it's also where all the good NATO bases were. But more importantly than that, they didn't see that NATO would survive as an entity if the Germans weren't in it. If you have the most powerful country on the continent of Europe that is not included in the security arrangement, that security arrangement cannot last. And if it can't last, then the United States loses its entryway again to being a strategic partner and player in Europe.
And our nukes were there too. I think what you're referring to is in 89-90, when the Soviet Union was in a lot of trouble, it still had a certain kind of leverage. And this is what George H.W. Bush and his people feared. That was Helmut Kohl, who was the leader of West Germany, was eager for unification, reunification, that he might strike a deal with Gorbachev for neutrality, meaning Germany would not join NATO, it would become a neutral power, and the Soviets would leave.
Dennis Miller had a great line about this. He said, I think about German unification like a Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin movie. I've seen the first few, and I really don't feel a need to see it again. So in the sense that everybody in Europe was concerned that German unification could lead to destabilizing conflict, and Germany's aspirations, perhaps if they were innate to the German culture and German spirit, had not been sated by decades of Cold War. And I know we're going to talk about the incredibly important meeting between Secretary of State James Baker and Mikhail Gorbachev, but there's a second meeting a few days later, which I think is actually more important, which is the meeting at Camp David between Helmut Kohl, leader of Germany, and George Bush, obviously President of the United States, in which those two leaders struck a handshake deal. The deal was, we, the United States, will back you, Kohl, and Germany in unifying. You can't do it without us. We're the most powerful kid on the block. We're really, in some sense, the only opinion that matters. The French are not keen on unification. The British are not keen on unification, but we can strong arm them. We will back you on unification if you give us one thing. And that one thing is you have to remain in NATO.
We share a common belief that a unified Germany should remain a full member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, including participation in its military structure. We agreed that U.S. military forces should remain stationed in a united Germany and elsewhere in Europe as a continuing guarantor of stability.
I'm not sure that Gorbachev ever made any kind of offer to Kohl about unification and neutrality, what I was referring to. But
it was in the air.
Yes, it was. And Bush was worried about it. As you write in your book, When the World Seemed New, if there was ever going to be a time when NATO would close up shop, it would have been then. But Bush early on decided NATO must remain in Europe and that Germany must be part of NATO once it's reunified. Why did he feel that way?
Bush is an interesting guy, not only because he had a lot of foreign policy experience, but because he was quite open. Even though he had been head of the CIA, he wasn't one to keep secrets, especially from his own diary. And in his diary, he consistently during this period comes back to the same central point, which he argues in then meetings with Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand of France and others, that with the Cold War ending, we shouldn't see the Soviets as an enemy anymore. Well, then who's our enemy? Who is NATO's enemy? If we don't have an enemy, why are we together? And Bush says quite plainly, our enemy is uncertainty. Our enemy is unknown. But the world is an unstable place. Now, you can, by the way, make an argument that nowhere in his thinking in January, February, March, April of 1990 was he actually thinking, when he talked about instability, that in just a few months, Saddam Hussein was going to invade Kuwait.
The crisis in the Persian Gulf, as grave as it is, also offers a rare opportunity to move toward an historic period of cooperation. Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge, a new era.
Now, the coalition reaction to the invasion of Kuwait was not a NATO mission, but it reinforces for Bush the central idea that the world is unpleasant, unstable, and dangerous. And we need not only power, but also allies. And we need to keep our allies close.
It's about U.S. hegemony in Europe as well, U.S. influence in Europe.
Exactly.
One wonders how history would have been different if Germany had become a neutral nation, right? And the Soviet Union withdrew and then would have supported German reunification. It seems hard to believe that NATO would have expanded anywhere else if Germany hadn't joined NATO right off the bat. I mean, I'm getting into some.
No, I think I agree with you. I think NATO, I buy the administration's line that NATO would not have survived long term without Germany. Now, I also have a hard time imagining the Germans still being completely demilitarized after 30 years. That's a different question entirely.
And there's another issue here, tension, when it comes to the future of Germany, and that is tension with, well, it was the Soviet Union then, and now Russia today. A big part of the story of the collapse of U.S.-Russia relations. To this day, some Russians, including Putin himself, say the U.S. misled his country when it came to the eastward extension or enlargement of NATO, whichever term you prefer. The U.S. in this argument humiliated Russia, exploited its weakness by bringing former Eastern Bloc and Soviet republics into NATO, beginning with East Germany. We'll eventually get to the Ukraine NATO problem, which is this is the origins of it, right? Because it's really a story about the West and Russia, the U.S. and Russia, and Russia's objections.
You could argue the origins of it is Peter the Great.
Oh,
is Russia part of Europe? And the dividing line that we talked about earlier, which is always there. There's always some dividing line in Europe. For Western Europe, Russia has always been on the other side. And for most of Russian history,
and as has Ukraine, by the way.
Yes, exactly. And for most of Russian history, the Russians have been peeved by that and have wanted to join in some form or fashion the West. So I don't know where that line moves back and forth over the course of 200, 300, 400 miles east-west over the course of history, but I do know that Moscow is always on the other side.
Well, we're not going back to Peter the Great because I don't do 10-hour.
Can I just jump in with one more funny point? I think this is a real problem. My family comes from Eastern Europe. They came over around the turn of the century, 1902, and I am often asked, where are they from? And I have to respond, what year are you talking about? Now, they didn't move, but sometimes they were in Hungary, sometimes they were in Austria, sometimes they were in Poland. They didn't move, but the lines kept moving around them.
It is amazing when you see how stable European borders have been, well, with the recent war notwithstanding, compared to the previous centuries. So let's talk about Baker and Gorbachev in 1990. This is the not 1 inch, the infamous promise, depending on which side of the argument you're on, that was made or not made. The point here is not to rehash the entire history again, because we've done that, and I talked to Mary Elise Sarati about it, but it's been a while since I've done a NATO Origins podcast. So, Russian leaders, foreign ministers, military figures have always balked at NATO's eastward advance, even when they eventually would give in to it, as did Gorbachev and Yeltsin, sometimes out of pure weakness, right? Mm-hmm. But I think this story about what happened in 1990 is still relevant to what's going on today, and that is, where should the dividing line fall? So, I'll let you pick it up from here, but Baker does have this conversation with Gorbachev in 1990, but it was just a conversation. It was not a treaty or a promise or any type of written agreement.
That's my interpretation, and I think that's the general interpretation, not universal, but general interpretation among scholars in the West. That is not the interpretation, of course, of Russians for the reasons I'm just about to explain. So just to bring everybody up to speed on where we are in the scene, this is spring of, actually late winter of 1990. The Berlin Wall has been down less than 3 months. Germany's future is unsure, and Eastern Europe is rapidly moving away from the Soviet Union. So you want to take a moment in history where the great snow globe of global politics has been shaken up, and nobody knows where the pieces are going to fall down. This is it, which is context that's important because Gorbachev and Baker have a very freewheeling discussion, what Henry Kissinger used to call it a tour de horizon, tour of the world, where they discuss every problem of the world in Moscow in 1990. One of the things, of course, that they focus on is Germany's future. And Baker says a couple things. First, he says, we have no interest particularly in sending NATO to the east. We don't want to move NATO 1 inch to the east. Gorbachev says, well, we don't really want it to move 1 inch to the east unless you make Europe and NATO the same thing. In fact, they discuss whether or not Gorbachev, in fact, puts this out there, whether or not it might be better for Russia, or the Soviet Union at that time, to join NATO. And Baker, being a good diplomat, doesn't say no, but he doesn't say yes either. If you think about the fact that Gorbachev heard the Secretary of State say in the same conversation, we don't expect NATO to move 1 inch to the east. In the same conversation where they talked about the Soviet Union, which is east, joining NATO, that gives you, I think, a great sense of how free-flowing this conversation was. Now, 2 points have to be stressed here. The first, you already mentioned, that this is a moment that Vladimir Putin and Russian nationalists will point to say, look, we were given a promise, though you exactly hit the nail on the head. This is not a promise, this is a conversation. A promise is something that's written down, especially when you're dealing with somebody like James Baker. The second point is Baker misspoke. And the Americans moved back from that position, if you will, within 48 hours. Because when Baker was talking about not moving the line 1 inch to the east, technically that would have included East Germany. So you would have had Germany coming into NATO, half in and half out. So as soon as Baker basically gets back to the United States and sits down and talks to Brent Scowcroft and George Bush, he realizes, okay, well, I wasn't talking about the line of East Germany. I was talking about the line of Germany. And of course, this is all within several months of free-flowing negotiations that are going on.
So I'll share a couple of sentences from Not 1 Inch, Mary Elise Serrati's book, about this meeting on February 9th. The American, meaning Baker, swiftly addressed the elephant in the room, a unified Germany's relations with NATO. Baker argued against neutrality. I mentioned the neutrality possibility before, warning Germany might decide to create its own nuclear potential if NATO were forced to pull its arsenal out. Baker presumably mentioned this prospect because he knew it would raise Moscow's hackles. Baker then repeated the key concept from his talks with Shevardnadze in the form of a question, unwittingly touching off a controversy that would last decades. Baker said, would you prefer to see a unified Germany outside of NATO, independent and with no U.S. forces, or would you prefer a unified Germany to be tied to NATO with assurances that NATO's jurisdiction would not shift 1 inch eastward from its present position? The Soviet leader replied that any expansion of the zone of NATO was not acceptable, and according to Gorbachev, Baker answered, we agree with that. But again, this was a conversation, and pretty quickly after, as you said, Baker realized that he probably went too far. Serrati goes on to say, for decades after, various leaders in Moscow would point to this exchange as an agreement barring NATO from expanding beyond its eastern Cold War border.
If you take a step back and think about the way Baker framed the entire question, because as you point out, it's about Germany, what he really is asking Gorbachev there is, how do you think we, all of us, should restrain the Germans in the future? Because again, anytime the Germans are independent, that has led to war in our historical memory. Now, we can argue over whether that's an accurate reading of the causes of the First and Second World War, but I guarantee you every policymaker at that time believed Germany was the cause. So Baker is asking, we need to put restraints on the Germans. Do you think it's better inside NATO or to have them independent? And Gorbachev doesn't balk at the notion that, yes, the Americans and NATO could be a great restraint upon Germany.
And we can go back to the very beginning of a divided Germany, 1955, right? West Germany and East Germany are formed. Mary Elise Serrati, in an essay in Foreign Affairs, argues that people who say Ukraine can join NATO today, even though it's in the midst of a war and its territory is divided de facto, right? Because you got Russian troops in part of it. She says people are misreading that history. She says in the aftermath of World War II, European neighbors scarred by memories of Nazis were understandably hesitant to let Germans rearm. But the combination of Soviet strength and a divided Germany's weakness at the front line trumped bitter memories. European neighbors could live with a rump portion of divided Germany rearming as a NATO ally. That would be West Germany in the face of the Soviet threat. She says German division enabled West German accession to NATO. Today, the opposite would unfold. Ukrainian accession to NATO would enable Ukrainian division. In a sense, you'd be creating a de facto West Ukraine and East Ukraine by making Ukraine a member of NATO today.
Well, you certainly would have to decide where the dividing line is between Russia and Ukraine, where the border is.
Well, it changes every hour.
Well, and this is a real question from my perspective. When we talk about Ukraine joining NATO, which is something that NATO leaders at the last summit just last week said was the long-term expected goal. Now, they did not say when and they did not say how, but they said, we expect that someday when the situation is right, Ukraine will join NATO. Well, that's as open-ended a promise as you could possibly get. But the real problem is because NATO fundamentally is a security pact that includes the famous Article 5 stipulation, which is that an attack against one is interpreted as an attack against all. You better damn well know where the borders are so that if somebody is attacking you, you can tell.
You know, Jeff, some observers have said, well, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a military response to Article 5, right? But then what's Article 5 good for? And other countries, as Mary points out, Professor Sarate, they might look at this and say, hold on now. So if you're not going to militarily respond if Ukraine's Article 5 pledge is violated, however you want to put it, what about us?
And I think this is actually a key aspect of the American response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. America stepped up, I think the United States, the Biden administration, maybe to be specific, stepped up and decided this was a moment for American leadership, not only or perhaps not even primarily because of Ukraine, but because of a concern after 4 years of Donald Trump denigrating the NATO alliance and saying, Donald Trump said out loud several times as part of his policy that he's not sure that he would respect Article 5 if a country was attacked. He actually said out loud, and I say out loud because it's so anathema to every other policymaker ever. He said out loud that before he would respond militarily, he would see whether that country had paid their dues to NATO.
But you know what? This is, though, the fundamental problem with NATO enlargement. It has gone to places where NATO can't actually defend. The Baltic states, and not that Russia's going to invade. There's another piece of this here. I don't see Russia invading the Baltic states or Poland or anywhere else anytime soon, or Finland or anything. It's about Ukraine, but go ahead.
I'm going to disagree with you on that, actually. I'm going to say that there are many problems with NATO enlargement. And I, as a historian and as a citizen of the world, am still not sure it was a good idea. But I do think that every place that NATO has expanded to, NATO can defend, because its military is, frankly, light years ahead of the Russian military. So the question, I think, that really drives whether or not Ukraine should be a part of NATO or is going to join NATO is that once Ukraine is a part of NATO, it's hands off for the Russians. So until that moment, everything is still up in the air.
Is it, though? Can we really guarantee anything like that?
Well, I mean, I can't guarantee I'm going to make it home today in my car.
Whoa.
You know, so and I can't guarantee that somebody might do something irrational or stupid. You know, I'm one of those people, full disclosure, who said in February of last year, there's no way that Vladimir Putin is going to invade Ukraine. This is all saber rattling, because here are the following 14 reasons why it's a bad idea. Now, I'm proud of myself that those 14 reasons have largely proven true. His troops aren't as good. NATO is going to give arms, et cetera, et cetera. It'll strengthen NATO. But my conclusion at that time was Vladimir Putin will not invade. Well, color me wrong.
Though I do not want a NATO versus Russia, West versus Russia war.
No, thank you. I'm with you on that.
I mean, that's the issue here, though, when it comes to putting Ukraine in NATO. It raises the possibility of a direct conflict between these two power blocks, if you will. Maybe we'll return to that. I know you want to interject there, but I want to go back to the early 90s again, because the focus of this episode, Jeff, is how was it that Ukraine never makes it into the club? There's been talk of Ukraine possibly joining NATO at some point in the future, going back to the early 1990s, maybe as an inducement to get Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons it inherited from the USSR after the end of the Cold War. And now that process wraps up in 1994 when an agreement is reached. Ukraine would cede those weapons, and Russia agreed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty. Also in 1994, we get the Clinton administration's plan for the Partnership for Peace. Now, this was designed to placate Russian concerns about NATO enlargement. The partnership is a club for everybody to join. Ukraine joins it in 1994. But the partnership doesn't last very long, and instead of a club for everyone to maybe one day join NATO, we get a more immediate NATO expansion to 3 countries in 1999 in Eastern Europe. So what I'm trying to get at is this mix in the early to mid-1990s.
Sure.
This talk of Ukraine potentially getting into NATO has been around for 30 years, and there have always been, I think, legitimate reasons why it didn't happen.
Well, let's take a step back and think about why policymakers in the West, in Eastern Europe, and in Russia might or might not want NATO expansion. And let's use Václav Havel as a great example. He, of course, was the playwright turned president in post-communist Czechoslovakia. Havel, when the Berlin Wall first fell, and 3 weeks later, the Czechoslovakian Revolution occurred, Havel made the point that we want out of the Warsaw Pact, but we want out of everything. We're tired of being in the center of Europe and being run over by everybody. So we're going to not play this game at all. We want to be neutral. Within 6-7 months, he completely changes his mind. And he starts to become a vigorous advocate, as was Lech Walesa in Poland, of quick joining of NATO. Why? Because I think that they saw the historical writing on the wall and said, no matter how much people might squirm under American power and American hegemony and within the American empire, that's nothing like being under the Soviets or parenthetically the Chinese.
And there were other benefits to NATO membership as well, right? I mean, you could get into the EU afterward. Basically, how it works.
And that's the second part of it, was that there was a conflation between democracy expansion and NATO expansion. The idea being that at the end of the Cold War, again, democracy, in Francis Fukuyama's famous words, had essentially brought us to the end of history, that democracy was the way of the future and was never going back. Funny words now to think about. And that countries that were in NATO would be stabilized militarily, which would enable their not just democratization, but the strengthening of their nascent democracies. So there's a very strong argument within the Clinton administration in particular by people who say, let's push NATO, because it would be kind of like saying, let's expand the range of, now I know this is a difficult analogy in our day of 2022, but it'd be kind of like saying, let's extend the range of the police department to include the local communities, or let's extend the fire department, less controversial, to include local communities. We know those local communities at some point are going to have to build their own fire department, and that we'd like to work with them. But until they do, let's give them some protection so they don't have to worry about fire.
The Partnership for Peace was supposed to be for everybody, and Ukraine joined it. Yeltsin thought it was a great idea because it would postpone, NATO enlargement, which actually does not happen until 1999 with those first three countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, after Yeltsin had been reelected in 1996. But in retrospect, was this balancing act simply not sustainable? On the one hand, placate Russia, but on the other hand, accede to the demands of those countries in Eastern Europe, former Soviet bloc countries that wanted to join NATO sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and just so everybody's on the same page here, the Partnership for Peace was not necessarily a pre-NATO, but it was a way to start doing military exchanges, military arrangements. The United States and its allies, wanted Eastern European governments and militaries in particular to have a better sense of our values of military-civil relations. So it was an exchange program, if you will, that would someday perhaps lead to expansion. In fact, 1993, American policymakers agree with their NATO allies that NATO is not ready to expand, but that we want to offer this handshake to Eastern Europe and to Russia, the Partnership for Peace, so that all countries can in someday think about joining. All countries, by the way, including Russia. Now,
there's a process that had to be followed because Ukraine wasn't ready for NATO membership then.
Nobody was ready for NATO membership. And Boris Yeltsin, who, of course, first president of a democratic, in quotations, Russia, post-Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin hears from the Americans, from Secretary of State Warren Christopher, one thing that he likes and one thing that he really doesn't. The first thing he likes, and this is in early 94, the first thing he likes is, the Partnership for Peace is not going to be an immediate NATO expansion. Great. That's awesome. And in fact, we love being a part of the Partnership for Peace. That sounds great. I'm glad you're including everybody, including us. And then Christopher says, and with the idea that someday NATO will expand. And Yeltsin says, well, that's not what we want either. But it also demonstrates that this is still a fluid moment where, I would argue, Russia could have been further integrated into the West and not have the problems that we have today. But I put the blame of that on Russia, not on the United States and on the West.
Russia is not innocent here, right? Its own behavior in Chechnya, of course, 1993, when Yeltsin spills blood to remain in power, and the 1990s, in sum, a terrible decade for Russia. Market economy and democracy experiment did not go well.
The Eastern European countries, the former Soviet bloc, had to, on their own, find their own ways towards democracy. And before the Ukraine crisis of the last year, the single most important issue facing European security strategists was what to do with the fact that countries like Poland and Hungary, which were part of our security structure, and Turkey, by the way, were seemingly less and less democratic. My point being that democracy is hard. I mean, you see that from our own country. Yes. Democracy is hard. And in 1993, the assessment was nobody in the Eastern Bloc is ready, though we like the direction things are trending.
Here's a quote from Leonid Kravchuk. He was Ukraine's leader in the early 90s, and this is at a press conference he holds with Bill Clinton about getting rid of Ukraine's nukes and signing a number of agreements so the countries could cooperate with each other. Kravchuk says,
the new balance of forces on the political map of the world clearly indicates the need to create a global security system which would be based on entirely new principles. We understand that the complicated processes of international security and peace are intertwined and cannot permit gaps in the vacuum to exist in this or that part of the world, especially on the European continent.
What he's getting at there is, well, what actually did happen. Ukraine wound up in a no man's land, if you will.
Well, but there's a lot of space between the mid-1990s and
well, I'm going to get to 2008.
Yeah, well,
in the Bucharest conference.
We also need to go back 2 steps, I guess. One which you brought up, which was that American policymakers joined with others to say that Ukraine, before anything happens after the Soviet Union falls, Ukraine has to give up its nuclear weapons. By the way, the Ukrainians really wanted to give up their nuclear weapons. They thought that nuclear weapons were dangerous. They thought they were expensive.
Not a deterrent. They never had full command and control of them. It would be very expensive to get to that point. They did want to get rid of them, but on their terms.
And we, the United States, also gave security guarantees at that point. So the first issue is the central question of Ukraine in 1993, 94, 95. Was let's make sure the nukes are taken care of, and then we have to go in and, by the way, secure them. The second central question for Ukraine, which is important here, is American policymakers before the Soviet Union fell in the spring of 1991, when there was a nationalist separatist movement politically in Ukraine, as there were in several other Soviet states, including Russia. By the way, Boris Yeltsin was in charge of the one in Russia. Ukrainians thought about breaking up the Soviet Union. And George Bush, and this is not his best moment, I think, George Bush made the point that the Soviet Union is itself stabilizing, that don't go breaking up the Soviet Union into 16 different pieces, 8 of which have nuclear weapons. Let's not be hasty in our reforms.
This is the Chicken Kiev speech.
Chicken Kiev speech, yeah, exactly.
And yet freedom is not the same as independence. Americans will not support those who seek independence in order to replace a far-off tyranny with a local despotism. They will not aid those who promote a suicidal nationalism based upon ethnic hatred. We will support those who want to build democracy.
He basically says that Ukraine may not be ready to be an independent country.
If we're going to shake the big snow globe, let's not break up the biggest piece that's falling down.
Yeah, for all those decades of containing communism, rolling back communism, hoping one day communism would go away, but then when it looks like the Soviet Union is actually going to fall to pieces and there could be chaos, wait, no, not that fast.
The first rule of being a historian is learning that the most powerful force in the universe, by far, is irony.
Indeed. So we talked about 1990 and the roots of the distrust between the U.S. and Russia, the Baker-Gorbachev meeting and the not 1 inch. We talked about the Partnership for Peace and in the mid-1990s, promises made to Yeltsin that there would not be full-throttle NATO enlargement that turned out to be promises that were broken, at least from the Russian perspective. And then
from the Russian perspective.
Yeah, and you can make the case that, Yeltsin had a point there. Setting aside the issue that these countries actually did want to join NATO and, the Russia couldn't stop them from doing that.
That's a big thing to set aside.
Yeah, we can't set that aside. Obviously, we can't. So then we get to 2007. Vladimir Putin speaks at the Munich Security Conference, where he basically said he's had enough of the U.S.-led world order. And a lot has happened since then. 9/11, right? The invasion of Iraq, he was opposed to it. Then in 2008, the Bucharest Conference, where George W. Bush goes up there and talks about Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO.
These two nations inspired the world with their rose and orange revolutions. And now they're working to consolidate their democratic gains and cement their independence. Welcoming them into the Membership Action Plan would send a signal to their citizens that if they continue on the path to democracy and reform, they will be welcomed into the institutions of Europe.
It was insincere. What's your judgment on Bush's move that day? In retrospect, it looks really reckless.
I would actually focus on your use of the word insincere, because I think sincerity is actually a big part of the story for George W. Bush. Now, remember, this is George W. Bush in 2008. This is coming to the close of what many historians, myself included, would consider to be, if not then among the worst foreign policy and strategic decisions that any American president and administration had ever made, i.e. the war in Iraq. And American prestige is at a low, but Bush still believes fundamentally, and still believes today, that freedom, by which he means something along the lines of democracy and markets, that freedom is something that every human being is entitled to. And that NATO, by extension, is how people will help to get freedom in Eastern Europe. So he makes the point, even though almost none of his NATO allies agree, he makes the point at Bucharest that we should go ahead and bring in Ukraine and Georgia because they want to be free, and I believe in freedom. It really is actually quite sincere in Bush's mind. In fact, I would argue that the sincerity in some ways is part of the problem, that he fundamentally believed this and still does, that freedom is for everybody, and that therefore democracy needs to be expanded.
But look at all the practical problems that existed then, and these were, of course, extant earlier in the 1990s. The Russians had a naval base at Sevastopol. The very nature of the commitment was a practical obstacle. Ukraine's a huge country, right? And for a while, it had been one of the most corrupt countries in Europe, too, which was an impediment to it joining NATO and the EU.
Still probably is, by the way.
France and Germany objected to Ukraine's accession. And then in 2010, Yanukovych is elected and basically says, we already have a close enough relationship with NATO. We don't need to actually join NATO. He was a pro-Russian leader. So, Jeffrey Engel, there's all these practical obstacles in the way. It just doesn't seem that it was ever really possible. I don't want to say ever really possible, but I will.
Back of the envelope calculation, including multiple simultaneous overlapping counterfactuals. If Ukraine had become a member of NATO in 2008, it would not be in war today against Russia. There would not have been a war because Russia was never going to attack NATO. And you say, by the way, I agree with what you're saying, that, wait a minute, there's this impediment, there's this problem, there's this difficulty, there's this unlikelihood, and the probability of this working out is small, to which I would say, if you were going to place bets on those 13 American colonies being able to make themselves a country that lasted as a union, you would get probably about the same odds, I think, as Ukraine surviving. So my point being, yes, it would have been hard, but hard things are surmountable through effort.
But Russia will never abide Ukraine in NATO. I don't know if I would say President Obama was a realist, but I often hearken back to his interview he gave in 2016 to The Atlantic near the end of his presidency, where he said Ukraine is a core Russian interest, not an American one. No matter what happens in this war, Russia will still be next to Ukraine.
Well, let me be clear. I am not a fan of, in 2008 or subsequently, bringing Ukraine in for the reason that you mentioned. People who are concerned that the Russians are going to consider that an advance against their frontiers have a legitimate point. A bigger point, I think, though, is while we consider that, we don't let that determine our actions.
Jeffrey Engel, historian and author of When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Clarence Thomas and the 14th Amendment, our guest will be the eminent historian of Reconstruction, Eric Foner. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.